So much fire. I think our videographer really likes fire, so when we give him that image to play with, he goes to town. Good morning, everyone. My name is Evie Martin. I'm the lead pastor here at Plattwoods Church. It is great to be gathered together here in this space, and also for those of you joining us online, a special welcome to you this morning. You know, in true Missouri fashion, a few weeks ago, we hauled in our plants for one last overnight freeze, and then had 4 perfect days of spring, and now here we are, on into the blazes of summer. If you were here in person last Sunday, you know that we really sort of missed our opportunity to launch this series, as our recently serviced air conditioner had a momentary identity crisis and couldn't figure out how to cool this space on a day that was 93 degrees. What better way we could have started coming in hot? But we missed that opportunity. Some of you may have been brought up in a church tradition where these images evoke memories of sermons on hellfire and brimstone. You might be ready to crawl under your chair or run out the door right now, but please don't. That's not the kind of coming in hot we're talking about. This fire is going to be a lot more fun. And while we did time this series to coincide with our physical season of the year, we also lined it up with a church season that we don't always celebrate like we should. A few Sundays from now is the church holiday called Pentecost. And that's the day in the book of Acts, 50 days after Jesus' resurrection, when the Holy Spirit came down like tongues of fire on the disciples and sent them out to proclaim the gospel. The good news of Jesus began to spread like wildfire, and the church was born. That's like kind of a big deal, considering we're all still gathering here 2,000 years later for church. So working backwards from that day of Pentecost, we're doing something a little different than I've done before in a series. We're taking that image of the flame, the fire, and tracing it throughout Scripture to see what it might illuminate for us. Why does it matter? What's important about it? What can the everyday, familiar, and powerful substance of fire show us about how God shows up for us? It seems God has a knack for coming in hot. Most of the time there is fire in the Bible, it is a sign of God's presence with people, somehow. Even today, in our worship together, every week we signify God's presence among us with fire. You probably never think about it, but we do it. Where's the fire? Right here. It's in the candles. We don't just do that for ambiance or like to make things look nice. There's actually a spiritual thing happening here. The flames speak to us that God is in our midst. I can get even more liturgically nerdy for you and tell you that most high tradition churches use just 2 candles always to represent the light of Christ as both fully human and fully divine, but I digress. All of that is to say that if worship starts and you notice that we have forgotten to light the candles, any of you now has permission to jump up and come light them. The lighter is back behind on the table, so just make sure we do that. God is present with us here. Let's make sure God is coming in hot. The very nature of a metaphor or a symbol is that it can contain all kinds of layers of meaning for us. So today we'll dive into some of the earliest stories of fire in the Bible and see what God has in store for us there. I want to begin in the book of Exodus. Exodus is the second book in the Bible. It's where we find most of the story of Moses and the epic saga of God rescuing God's people from their enslavement in Egypt. It's also the book where we find probably the most iconic scene of God coming in hot. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses was taking care of the flock for his father-in-law Jethro, Midian's priest. He led his flock out to the edge of the desert, and he came to God's mountain called Horeb. The Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire in the middle of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was in flames, but it didn't burn up. Then Moses said to himself, "Let me check out this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't burning up." When the Lord saw that he was coming to look, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." Moses said, I'm here. You may have heard this story of the burning bush before. Even if you're not a longtime church person, that concept of a burning bush moment might still be familiar to you. Here's Moses going about his daily work. He wasn't on some spiritual pilgrimage looking for God. He wasn't at the end of his rope needing some hope to hold on to. He wasn't doing anything particularly out of the ordinary. He was working, tending to his father-in-law's sheep. Now, that's not to say that he hadn't had some stuff going on in the years prior. Chapters 1 and 2 are full of Moses' drama, and there was a lot. So he had come to Midian, away from Egypt, for a bit of a fresh start, and maybe a season of quiet living, just tending the sheep. But obviously, this is not the extent of the life in store for Moses, because on this ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I'm pretty sure it was a Tuesday, that's not in the original Hebrew, but we're just going to guess, something a little out of the ordinary catches his eye. Something on fire. Fire always draws our eye, doesn't it? Whether it's a flicker in the darkness of night, or even a flame on the horizon in the brightness of day, fire makes us look. Moses looked. There was a bush with a flame. A flame of fire, the text says, which sounds redundant, so I researched it. The word for flame here in Hebrew is labat. It's the only place in the entire Old Testament that particular word is used. I don't know that that means anything profound, but it says to me that flame of fire is probably something a little different than just a regular old flame or a regular old fire. A flame of fire. Clearly, it was something meant to call attention to itself. Moses can see that too. The bush is on fire, but it's not burning up. He breaks from his shepherd's daydreams and moves in closer to the flame of fire to investigate. And as he does, God speaks. And God says the one thing that without fail will always get our attention. God says his name, Moses. Moses responds with what sounds obvious and simple. I'm here. Except I think that's actually a very profound response. I'm here. I am fully present, fully engaged. I am not distracted. My attention is no longer with my sheep or my daydreams or my family back home or the problems I ran away from in Egypt or my desire for the latest designer model of a shepherd's crook. I'm here. Only here. You have my full attention. When was the last time you were here? Not here, but fully attentive in the present moment. Freed from the 8 million distractions vying for your time and your thoughts and your energy. When God shows up in the fire of the burning bush that wasn't burning, the first thing God does is grab Moses' attention. Fire gets our attention. I have to share a completely random and wild story that I just heard from Ann Bartholow a few weeks ago. Many of you know Ann. She just retired recently from our staff after 2.5 decades of ministry at Platt Woods Church. She told our staff a story that none of them had ever heard before, and so I asked her permission to retell it, although I can't even hold a candle to her storytelling talent. But years ago, in one of the many building phases of this church, there was a period of time in which the top level of the education wing was still in its skeletal phase. It was more or less open to the elements as rafters and beams began to take their rightful places. For whatever reason, Ann Bartholow and Janice Ramsey, who many of you also know, would take it upon themselves to go grab flashlights and explore this area on their own after the construction crew had gone home for the evening. They would go poke around up in the rafters, those are Ann's words, and see what was what. Now, don't even ask me what possessed or who allowed these women to wander around on an active construction site 3 stories above the face of the earth, but apparently this is what they did, with some frequency. Someone had to make sure the project got done right, I guess. Well, wouldn't you know, one night in the midst of their exploration, something caught their eye off yonder through the rafters. "Janice, is that a fire?" Anne mused. They picked their way closer, and sure enough, a small fire had begun to smolder there amidst the construction debris, unbeknownst to the crew who had left for the night. The flames were not flickering out on their own, so off Janice and Anne scampered to notify the authorities. The fire was extinguished, the cause identified as some rogue sparks from welding earlier in the day, and somehow this story has vanished from the lore and legend of Plattwoods Church. But y'all, a generation ago, Anne and Janice saved this church. That entire wing over there might have never existed if they hadn't been climbing the rafters after hours and been present for the flickering flames to grab their attention. That story is absolutely wild to me. All of that to say, fire has the power to grab our attention. So fire reminds us that God is trying to get our attention too. The thing that happens next with Moses and the burning bush is that once God has his attention, God then has something to show him. In the form of a flame, God illuminates for Moses the injustice that is breaking God's heart. Moses has been gone from Egypt for quite some time. He had been witness to the plight of the Israelites, even angered by it himself, and it got him into trouble. That's why he then fled to Midian to get away from it all. But God says to him, "Hang on, stuff is still really bad." Then the Lord said, "I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I've heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain. I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians in order to take them out of that land and bring them to a good and a broad land, a land that's full of milk and honey, a place where the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites all live. Now the Israelites' cries of injustice have reached me. I've seen just how much the Egyptians have oppressed them." Once God gets our attention, it is highly likely that God is going to want to show us something that isn't right with the world. The flame of God will illuminate the places where the downtrodden can't seem to get to their feet, where the powerful have their knees against the necks of those just trying to get by, where people in pain cannot receive the care for their bodies that they need, where the vulnerable are expected to keep living in fear so the wicked can collect their checks from the gun lobby, where children are starving because corrupt leaders cannot guarantee food for their people, where human beings in the image of God are still today being bought and sold, trafficked to meet the demand of unmitigated greed. God heard the cries of injustice in Egypt, and God hears the cries of injustice still in our cities, our nation, in places riddled with suffering around the world. And when God gets our attention, God will want to point it out to us too. Because the very next thing the burning bush God does with Moses is to send him. "So get going. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." The fire in this story in Exodus shows us a three-part sequence of what happens when God is present. God grabs our attention, God illuminates injustice for us, and God sends us to do something about it. Maybe this is why we say, don't play with fire. If we do, we should be ready to step into some really hard but really courageous places. So what does this fire story mean for you and me Graduates in the room today, is there something in this story for you as you're setting your course for the years to come? What might happen in our lives if we looked up over the busyness and the noise of our daily activities and caught a glimpse of the fire of God flickering just a little way ahead? Would it change what we do for the rest of the day, or tomorrow, or maybe the rest of our lives? I've never actually seen a burning bush. The fire in my fire pit has never spoken to me or sent me anywhere. But maybe holding this story closely will make us think differently about what God is asking of us. Maybe the next time you find yourself staring contemplatively into a fire. And even without a fire right in front of us, this story begs some questions. If God's not grabbing your attention right now, who is? What is? Our attention is always going to be somewhere. So often these days, it's going to the handheld computers we all walk around with. Just watch people in line at the grocery store or riding on the streetcar or in the doctor's waiting room. We now hold the power in our hands for attention to take us anywhere but here. To whatever it is celebrities are up to the latest news media and noise and toxic discourse, to how the stock market is performing, to what our friends are doing after they graduate and how perfectly their plans are taking shape while we're still just trying to make it across the stage without tripping on our gown. Our attention can be pulled 100 different directions at 1,000 miles an hour. And yet, for God to get our attention, we need those times in our days when we look away from what is right in front of us and catch a glimpse of the fire of God and say, like Moses, I'm here. What has your attention? Is it going to the right places and people? And for what purpose? Are we paying attention to meaningful things, to people who we trust to lead us closer to Jesus and not farther away? Or are we wasting our precious time attending to worries, to fearmongers, to fabricated problems that are meaningless? If God grabbed our attention, would God be sending us forth to squabble over who's in and who's out? Or would God point out to us that our neighbor's kid seems lonely and could use a friend, maybe some snacks after school? If God grabbed our attention, would God illuminate more possibilities for gain with our 401k, or would God point out that giving money away actually changes the world around us? If God grabbed our attention, would God send us to our comfortable homes to be afraid of a world we don't understand and ignore realities we don't want to face, or would God send us, just like Moses, right into the melee to find the people who are lost and abandoned, brokenhearted and exploited, and bring them to a place with milk and honey, a promised land, a sanctuary city, a church, a home where they belong and they can rest from the pain of the world? When God shows up in fire, God is truly coming in hot. The flames don't make small asks of us. They illuminate the things that break God's heart in the world around us, and then they light a fire underneath us so we will get up and go. May the fire of God catch your eye this week. May you put down what you're doing long enough to look, to listen, to see the vision of God for a fuller life for all people. And may we have the courage together to go when God says to us, so get going. I am sending you. Will you pray with me? God, just as you called Moses so long ago with your flame of fire, so you call each one of us to speak and to act on your behalf in our world today. Forgive us when we are hesitant to follow, when we question your call, when we make excuses for our abilities, when we complain about our lack of time or hoard our resources. Give us courage to step out in faith, to follow where you lead without hesitation or fear, trusting that your presence goes with us and that you will provide all that we need. Amen.